This video is a part of our legal research presentation project. My group and I have chosen to research and discuss the legal topic of the death penalty. In the video we will discuss a brief background of the death penalty itself, then we will mention the pros of having it in place and also the cons of using it in a country. For each side of the pros and the cons, we will present an example in the form such as perhaps a case or an article to back up our argument. And then finally, in the conclusion, we will summarise the content discussed within the video and then conclude with our overall thoughts of how the death penalty is used and do we think it's right.
The death penalty is more recent than we think. The last public hearing was in 1868, but it was only amended into the Constitution in 2001. The Capital Amendment Act of 1868 put an end to public executions, therefore executions only took place behind prison walls. Michael Manning was the last to be executed in 1954 for rape and murder of a nurse. In 1964 it was abolished for all offences other than treason, capital murder and certain military offences. The last time it was enacted was in 1976 when a couple murdered Garda Michael Reynolds. They were sentenced to death, although later being overturned and sentenced to life imprisonment as Reynolds was off duty and the Murrays didn't know he was a guard. The President is the only person who has the power to pardon or commute death sentences under Article 13.6. During the 1916 Rising, the death penalty would result in a huge change in public opinion on Ireland being a republic. Not many people cared much for the republic, but after the 16 leaders were executed by General Maxwell, it began to support the Rising. Therefore, we have the death penalty to thank for the Irish Republic. The death penalty was abolished in 1990. It also a requirement of the membership of the EU. The death penalty was only abolished from the Constitution in 2001 following a referendum which had a narrow victory of 62% to 38%. It was brought in by Bertie Ahern's Fianna Fáil government and it was for constitutional standing and to prevent future governments from reintroducing it without a referendum.
Pros of the death penalty. The Fifth Amendment in the US states a person should be held to answer for a capital crime. The penalty needs to be proportionate to the crime, and some crimes are so heinous that the only punishment that fits the bill is the death penalty. The death penalty can save lives. It acts as a deterrent, and there's a link between reduced homicide rates in states where the death penalty has been introduced. The death penalty can bring closure to families. Families who have seen a loved one murder will have closure when they see the perpetrator put under the punishment of the death penalty. The death penalty is not a decision taken lightly. It is taken before an independent judge, 12 jury and a unanimous decision, while the defendant has been represented by the best attorneys. Some people claim there's racial bias within the death penalty, but this is untrue. 48.6% of the people killed under the death penalty were actually white, which is the majority in this case. The death penalty is seen as inhumane to some, but it is done in the safest way possible, and the people who are being put under the death penalty receive professional care from physicians right up until the end. These are just some of the pros of the death penalty.
My name is Marco Centrich and I'm doing the cons of the death penalty. There are many cons to the death penalty. Studies from the Oklahoma Death Penalty Review Board revealed that seeking the death penalty costs taxpayers more than not seeking them. So seeking them costs an average $700,000. This has to do with the endless appeals and additional procedures. Therefore, it costs more to enact the death penalty than to keep someone in prison. Secondly, it's also seen as barbaric to kill human beings. Thirdly, the endless appeals would clog the court system of the US. The court system goes through a lot before allowing a death sentence to be carried out. So all the appeals, motions, hearings, etc. take over much time of judges. This time could be instead used for unresolved matters instead. It also sends the wrong message to society. It basically states that if you killed one of us, we'll kill you.
My name is Kevin Culhane and I'm going to be talking about an example why the death penalty is a good thing. Firstly, one major benefit of the death penalty is that it completely removes the possibility that convicted criminals will be able to kill again. An example of this is the case of American serial killer, rapist, kidnapper and necrophile Ted Bundy. Bundy has been described by his biographer Anne Rule as a sociopathic person who takes pleasure from another human's pain, and he was even described by one of his defence attorneys, Polly Nelson, as the very definition of pure evil. These are just two descriptions of Bundy that aim to encapsulate the evil nature of the man who confessed to committing 30 murders between 1974 and 1978. Ultimately, Bundy was executed for his crimes on the 24th of January 1989 in the electric chair. Therefore, one major benefit of the death penalty is that it completely eliminates the possibility that sadistic and cruel criminals such as Ted Bundy will ever kill again. In the case of Bundy, a life sentence in prison was not an adequate punishment for two reasons. The first reason being that his crimes were so heinous and detestable that death was the only justifiable punishment. Secondly, Bundy also had a history of escaping from custody, as was the case in 1977, when he escaped from a prison in Colorado Springs and 17 hours later travelled across the country to Chicago. He later committed more murders off the back of this elaborate escape. Therefore, in the case of sadistic and cruel serial killers such as Ted Bundy, the death penalty is often the only way to guarantee the absolute safety of innocent civilians.
My name is Matthew, and today I'm going to be talking about what I believe is a pro of the death penalty. An undeniable benefit of the death penalty is the economic effect it would have for the justice system. According to figures published in the Irish Times in 2016, it now costs the state €97,824 a year to keep a prisoner in Portlaoise Prison, Ireland's only high security prison system. This certainly high figure comes straight out of the taxpayer's pocket. Human rights activists would argue that the death penalty is inhumane, both morally and socially wrong. Isn't keeping someone locked up in a tiny cell and essentially throwing away the key just as bad? The mental effects of solitary confinement are well documented. Of course, the death penalty could only be used in cases where a gut-wrenchingly horrendous crime was committed and no mitigating factors are present. If such a crime were to occur, why should the taxpayers' hard-earned money be spent keeping a criminal alive? Taking a very broad look at it, isn't it painfully ironic that if a murderer was thrown up by a family member's house tonight and murdered them in the most cruel and unthinkable way possible, you would essentially have to pay for his upkeep and medical expenses as he sits rotting away in his cell for the rest of his life. You would have to continue working, paying your taxes in each month. These taxes are used by the government to fund the prison system, which holds the man who has caused you unimaginable grief. He gets a free psychiatric help, but what about you? Outside of the cost of keeping a prisoner incarcerated, there's also the factor of a trial. The availability of a death penalty charge gives the prosecutor a further bargaining chip. In cases where the evidence is clear-cut, the prosecution could offer the defendant a deal that in exchange for a guilty plea, the death penalty would not be pursued. This would save the state effort and resources in an already overcrowded court system.
Dugan, and I'll be giving an example of why the death penalty is a bad thing. The death penalty still exists in America today. However, it is estimated that 3% of executions in the US were flawed between the years of 1890 to 2010. Over these 120 years, 8,776 people were executed, and out of those, 276 went wrong in some way. These flawed executions occur when there is a breakdown in the protocol for a particular method of execution. This is a major disadvantage of the death penalty, as this can cause unnecessary agony and pain for the prisoner. An example of this case is the case of Dennis McGuire, who was executed on the 16th of January 2014 by lethal injection. The wrong amount of drug was injected into the prisoner, which resulted in horrific suffering. McGuire was reportedly gasping for air for 25 minutes after the injection was administered. Witnesses reported that he could be seen struggling with his stomach heaving and fists clenched. He could also be heard making choking sounds which distressed the people in the room. Due to this, McGuire's family filed a lawsuit stating that the inmate endured unnecessary pain and suffering, and it appeared as though he was suffering as a result of the injection.
Furman v. Georgia is a case which took place in the US Supreme Court in 1972. This case is particularly important because it was the first time in the history of the United States where the death penalty was seen as unconstitutional. The defendant was discovered burgling a home. When he attempted to flee, he dropped his weapon, which he was carrying. The gun was discharged. It hit the ground, resulting in the death of one of the family members. The courts convicted him of murder, and he was sentenced to death. However, the courts found that the imposition of the death penalty in this situation would be a cruel solution. The defendant argued that the death penalty was a ridiculous solution and violated his rights that were set out in the Constitution. In the 14th Amendment, it stated that citizens had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The court overturned the execution of Furman on the basis that it would have been a cruel and unusual punishment, which would have violated the 8th Amendment. Therefore, it was declared unconstitutional. This case is extremely important as, due to the verdict, The death penalty then became illegal in America in 1976.
My name is Megan Gahan and I'll be doing the conclusion for the death penalty. In conclusion, the death penalty as a punishment has been around for centuries. There is a number of both benefits and negative effects of utilising the death penalty as a punishment for crimes. As previously mentioned, some of the benefits include that the death penalty completely removes the possibility of criminals murdering or causing extreme pain again. Another benefit is that it ultimately saves the government thousands of euro, which would be spent annually on an inmate's prison sentence. It is mentioned above that on average it costs the state €97,824 a year on each individual inmate. This comes straight from the taxpayers' money, and if they are serving a life sentence, this could essentially be looked at as just throwing money away. In the majority of countries in the developed world, the death penalty is illegal. However, it is still legal in 57 countries. The death penalty is an extremely debated topic over whether it is right or wrong, and a vast majority of people have very strong and sometimes conflicting opinions on it.